back, my baby. Get her right back to oh. What's up, everybody? This is Vivian Green, and you're listening to the podcast on WilLaVeist.com.
It's the Wil LaVeist Show. Downloading the iHeartRadio.com app, which will enable you to check out the Wil LaVeist Show every Wednesday from noon to 1 p.m. You can also follow me on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and go to my website, WilLaVeist.com, where you can download podcasts of many of my best shows. People have been asking me all the time, can I download your show? Where can I get it? I miss it on Wednesdays at noon. I'm doing this, I'm doing that, and the other. Well, now you can go to my website, Wil LaVeist, that's WILLAVEIST.com. Download the podcast and also sign up for my e-blast, where you'll get emails about the next and upcoming shows and what the podcast is that I'm featuring at the moment. And in this next segment, National Museum of African American History and Culture. It opened officially on September 24th in Washington, D.C., and I had the pleasure of participating in the museum's media preview day, where journalists were given broad access to the facility and staff interviews. I can honestly tell you that I can't offer more positives about the museum. It's just a fantastic place. The building is impressive. The exhibits are inspiring. There's even the Sweet Home Cafe, which features unique Black American cuisine. That was my Brooklyn accent. Cuisine from different regions. Being there, you'll feel a great sense of pride as you will see on full display how African Americans have been vital to the building of America. It's also painful to see some of the exhibits, especially those focused on slavery, Jim Crow, and the ongoing fights for social and full justice and full equality and full citizenship in this country that we were so critical in building. You'll see, for example, how America at its beginnings is a nation of contradictions. For example, founding father Thomas Jefferson of the great state of Virginia, who wrote so eloquently about freedom and justice, yet, as we all know, had slaves, and despite no scientific evidence, he convinced himself and others that blacks were inferior, even less human. And this is how he justified to himself to be able to do the brutal things that he did as a founding father, talking about liberty, and then having slaves and fathering children of Sally Hemings, and obviously not allowing them to go free. So, I'm also proud to say that I'm a charter member of the museum. If you have a chance to visit, definitely make it happen. You'll need to return several times to get the full impact. And so when I was there, and I will be going back again probably a few more times this year, I interviewed Mary Elliott, who is one of the curators of the slavery exhibit. You'll hear that interview, and following her, you'll hear speeches from former President George W. Bush, who was instrumental in the signing of the legislation in support of the museum. And then finally, of course, President Barack Obama, who obviously exemplifies African-American history in his embodiment and just being the first black president. Here's that interview.
My name is Mary Elliott, and I am a museum specialist, and I co-curate at the Slavery and Freedom exhibition with my colleague, Nancy Burkhoff.
Give a quick overview of this exhibit.
We start the story of slavery and freedom a little bit before the 15th century, and we start with the story of Africa so that we can let people understand that Africa is a continent made up of diverse places, people, societies, culture, intellect, skills.
Right, Africa is not a country.
Right, and we humanize the story of Africans, right, so that people connect with the people whose story we've been honored to tell, right? And then we go into the development of the transatlantic slave trade. We talk about the Middle Passage. We look at the development of the nation. We look at the development of the Atlantic world, all based on this significance of the slave trade itself, the sale of people and their labor. Right?
And how it built Western society.
Exactly. That is my point about the Atlantic world and about this nation, right? So we talk about all of that. We look at the story of colonial North America. I did say we talk about the Middle Passage. Transatlantic slave trade, we look at the juxtaposition of profit and power to the human cost. We look at holding on to one's humanity under the most inhumane circumstances, particularly punching that in the story on the Middle Passage, right? But it's a consistent theme throughout, okay? And then when we get to colonial North America, we really look at the regions. We don't paint a broad stroke of what slavery was. We look at how African Americans helped create the nation, what they brought to the country, and how the landscape shaped them, right? So we talk about all of that. And we have very American moments. Revolutionary War, African American men fighting on the field for whichever side is going to promise them freedom, right? And then we come to the paradox of liberty. The paradox really gets into, here's this nation that's fighting for liberty, yet still holding on to enslaved men, women, and children. And you come through and you see the end of the international slave trade, but the kicking up of the domestic slave trade. And what that means when we get to the antebellum period and cotton comes into play. One thing I want to draw to your attention, in the transatlantic slave trade space, the driver of the trade is sugar. Here in the antebellum space, the driver of the trade is cotton. Too often people look at the story of slavery and think, cotton, antebellum, but we really want people to unpack how early this story starts and really think about sugar, what that impact was on the development of the Atlantic world.
You mentioned cotton, and one of the impressive, impactful sites is that cotton sack.
Yes, it
and
is.
How large it is. Talk about that.
We wanted to make sure people got the point. It's to let people know cotton was the driver. So when you end, the international slave trade ends for North America, you see the domestic slave trade kick in. There's a powerful film that we have here that we produce. And one of the things I think is important for people to understand, in that we talk about the 3/5 compromise, and we talk about what did it mean when you shift this population down to the Deep South, right? And with that shift and the whole idea of the 3/5 compromise, that shift in political power to slaveholders, right? That's very important. I can say this to you as a black woman talking to a black man. You know, we often think we were only 3/5 of a person. But the political implications of that are very important.
And still resonate today.
Exactly. Exactly.
You mentioned regions. Virginia,
Yes.
crucial to the whole slave story. You talked about Hampton University as being...
Well, Virginia is featured. We talk about the story of the Chesapeake in colonial North America. And then, of course, we talk about Franklin and Armfield, who were slave dealers in Alexandria, Virginia, right up the street here. So that is featured in our story on the domestic slave trade. When we get to emancipation, we talk about Virginia because we feature the story of the development of the HBCUs, and Hampton University is one of those stories we feature.
You also talk about the impact of Fort Monroe.
Yes,
and also
we do.
Hampton.
Yes, we talk about the
contraband being where
Yes.
slaves arrived as well.
And so we talk about how African American agency, how they drove that the Civil War was a fight for freedom. It was a people's fight for freedom. And so we're really excited about that. We feature a contraband tent that is on loan to us, and it really shows how people really fled to freedom. They forged freedom in their own way, and they forced this nation to stand up to its ideals.
You're standing next to Harriet Tubman's lace shawl. Personal impact, and when you see this, that it has on you as a black woman.
When I think of Harriet Tubman and this exhibition, you know, we grew up with like the Black History Month calendars and the books and the speeches. And it's kind of this, there's the story of Harriet Tubman, but this is very personal. You really get the sense of the woman, right? And what's really powerful to me is her hymnal. And so to know that she had this hymnal and she couldn't read, but to know that she had her favorite songs, that's very powerful. And many of those songs also relate to the work that she did, freeing hundreds of men and women and children. You brought up Virginia, and I also want to mention that we are featuring Nat Turner's Bible. And so that's another part that is associated with Virginia, and that's very powerful as well.
And now, when you talk about relevance, you're talking about a movie now about Nat Turner. You also talk about a series that's going on about Roots.
Underground, yeah.
What is your take on the relevance and what people are seeing now, the images on the big screen in terms of slavery, how that helps tie all that together?
So there's some people who say, why do we have to see another film on slavery, right? But one thing I will say is the films that I see coming out now, and I remember seeing Roots, that had a huge impact on me, right? And I will give credit to those folks who produced Roots, who starred in Roots, who directed Roots. But I also give credit to the folks today who are telling these stories today, and the contemporaries that are telling the stories now, and how they're telling it in a way that's helping people understand the complexities of these stories and really humanizing these stories and really understanding the resistance in these stories, the resilience in these stories, the fighting in these stories to fight for freedom. That's what I really do appreciate.
What do you make of the question, I'm sure you've gotten this a lot, as to why the need for a separate African-American museum?
I don't see it as so much separate. What I told someone earlier is that this museum, if you see how vast this museum is, they would have to build across 14th Street to include everything that we have. But what I will tell you is this. The Smithsonian, National Museum of Natural History, National Museum of American History, National Museum of African Art, right? National Museum of the American Indian have all helped us to bring this story to bear, right? They have loaned us artifacts. They have loaned us their intellect to help us understand these are some of the things that you can talk about. And so we really appreciate our colleagues for their insight as well as for their artifacts that they've given us to tell this story. When we open, those same museums are doing their part to do, whether it's online or features within their museums, to complement what we're doing in here. So this is a Smithsonian museum. It's not the separate. This is a Smithsonian effort. And we are so grateful to the Smithsonian for allowing us to tell this unvarnished truth.
Final thoughts?
My final thoughts is I am so glad that you all are here and you can see this story. And I hope that the way we're telling it, it resonates with you. That it is something you expected and you didn't expect, right? And that it'll prompt you to think a little bit more deeply about these stories, about what it means to be American, about the African-American experience, and think a little bit more deeply about it's time to have that discussion about race.
We're honored to be here. And my first reaction is I hope all our fellow citizens come and look at this place. It is fabulous. I was honored to sign the bill authorizing the construction of this national treasure. And I'm pleased it now stands where it has always belonged, on the National Mall. This museum is an important addition to our country for many reasons. Here are three. First, it shows our commitment to truth. Great nation does not hide its history. It faces its flaws and corrects them. This museum tells the truth that a country founded on the promise of liberty held millions in chains, that the price of our union was America's original sin. Second, this museum shows America's capacity to change. For centuries, slavery and segregation seemed permanent parts of our national life, but not to Nat Turner, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Rosa Parks, or Martin Luther King Jr. All answered cruelty with courage and hope. In a society governed by the people, no wrong lasts forever. After struggle and sacrifice, the American people, acting through the most democratic of means, amended the Constitution that originally treated slaves as 3/5 of a person to guarantee equal protection of the laws. After a decade of struggle, Civil Rights Acts and Voting Rights Acts were finally enacted. Even today, the journey toward justice is still not complete, but this museum will inspire us to go farther and get there faster. And finally, the museum showcases the talent of some of our finest Americans. The galleries celebrate not only African American equality, but African American greatness. I congratulate all those who played a role in creating this wonderful museum. May God bless us all.
The best history helps us recognize the mistakes that we've made and the dark corners of the human spirit that we need to guard against. And yes, a clear-eyed view of history can make us uncomfortable. It'll shake us out of familiar narratives. But it is precisely because of that discomfort that we learn and grow and harness our collective power to make this nation more perfect. That's the American story that this museum tells. One of suffering and delight. One of fear, but also of hope. Of wandering in the wilderness and then seeing out on the horizon a glimmer of the promised land. It is in this embrace of truth, as best as we can know it, in the celebration of the entire American experience, where real patriotism lies. As President Bush just said, a great nation doesn't shy from the truth. It strengthens us. It emboldens us. It should fortify us. It is an act of patriotism to understand where we've been. And this museum tells the story of so many patriots. Yes, African Americans have felt the cold weight of shackles and the stinging lash of the field whip, but we've also dared to run north and sing songs from Harriet Tubman's hymnal. We've buttoned up our Union blues to join the fight for our freedom. We've railed against injustice for decade upon decade, a lifetime of struggle and progress and enlightenment that we see etched in Frederick Douglass's mighty leonine gaze. Yes, this museum tells a story of people who felt the indignity, the small and large humiliations of a whites-only sign, or wept at the side of Emmett Till's coffin, or fell to their knees on shards of stained glass outside a church where 4 little girls died. But it also tells the story of the black and white youth sitting alongside each other, straight-backed, so full of dignity, on those lunch counter stools. The story of 6-year-old Ruby Bridges, pigtails, fresh pressed dress, walking that gauntlet to get to school. Tuskegee Airmen soaring the skies, not just to beat a dictator, but to reaffirm the promise of our democracy and remind us that all of us are created equal. This is the place to understand how protest and love of country don't merely coexist, but inform each other. How men can proudly win the gold for their country, but still insist on raising a black-gloved fist. How we can wear an I Can't Breathe t-shirt and still grieve for fallen police officers. Here's the America where the razor-sharp uniform of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff belongs alongside the cape of the Godfather of Soul. We have shown the world we can float like butterflies and sting like bees. That we can rocket into space like Mae Jemison and steal home like Jackie. Rock like Jimmy. Stir the pot like Richard Pryor. Or we can be sick and tired of being sick and tired like Fannie Lou Hamer. And still rock steady like Aretha Franklin. We are large Walt Whitman told us, containing multitudes. We are large, containing multitudes, full of contradictions. That's America. That's what makes us go. That's what makes us extraordinary. And as is true for America, so is true for the African American experience. We're not a burden on America or a stain on America. We're an object of pity or charity for America. We're America. And that's what this museum explains.
You've been listening to the Wil LaVeist podcast at WilLaVeist.com. Follow me on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. Go to my website and sign up for the e-blast to learn what I've got coming up next. And check out the website for where you can listen to the show live. Until next time, take care and God bless.